This is just a sample of the training available at itdvds.com. To see complete training, please go to itdvds.com. Let's begin the sample. At this point, we should be pretty familiar with IP version 4. We should know how to subnet it, how routing works, and that's definitely going to help us understand IP version 6. But sometimes we try to draw too many direct relationships between how something worked with IP version 4 and how it should work with IP version 6, and that's kind of where it can get confusing pretty fast. So we're going to go over some tips that we can put in our brain right now that will really help us pick up IP version 6 quickly. So the first thing is, the hardest part of IP version 6 is looking at the address. So here's an IP version 6 address, and you can see, man, this looks difficult. There's letters and numbers, much more difficult and longer than an IP version 4 address. IP version 4 was all numbers, and in general, we could pretty easily memorize an IP version 4 address. With an IP version 6 address, probably not going to memorize this, but as we'll see, the first half of this address in our network is going to be the same or pretty similar with all of our hosts and all of our nodes and all of our routers. So that will make things easier, but it's still going to be kind of difficult to memorize. So that's just something we're going to have to learn to work with going forward. So that's the bad news. Let's get to the good news. Subnetting is a piece of cake with IP version 6 because we're always going to use a /64. So with IP version 4, we would have maybe some subnets were a /24, some were a /30, some were a /16. And we know, because we've learned how to subnet with IP version 4, that it wasn't easy. It was difficult, and it added a lot of complexity. And man, if we didn't use subnetting for a little while, we might have forgot some of it. And we'd have to go back and learn, well, how to calculate a subnet. What does a /20 subnet look like when we write it out? Is it 255, 255, That was pretty difficult. With IP version 6, we don't have to worry about that. We're always going to use a /64, and that /64 is actually called a prefix now with IP version 6. One of the few times we'll have to worry about subnetting in IP version 6 is when we get normally we're really getting a block of subnets, basically, from our ISP that will be like a /48. And we'll break that block of subnets up into /64s that we'll use on our network. But again, we're always going to be using a /64 subnet on all of our subnets. Even when we have point-to-point links with two routers, two interfaces that are directly connected, we're still going to use a /64. And the nice thing about picking up IP version 6 at this particular point in time, and the year is just about 2014 at the making of this movie, is that a lot of the debates over IP version 6 have happened, and we've come to conclusions. And best practices are starting to emerge. So we don't have to think about a lot of this too in-depth. It's basically, this is how it works, and the reasoning behind it has been debated, and they've came to a conclusion. One of the conclusions is we're always going to use a /64 in our subnets. The other one is don't worry about wasting IP addresses. This is going to be very hard for a lot of us coming from IP version 4 because that's kind of what got us in this situation. In IP version 4, we ran out of IP addresses. Now we had to create IP version 6 to have more IP addresses. And now we're going to waste. So a /64 has trillions and trillions and trillions of IP addresses. So every time we create a subnet, we're wasting trillions and trillions and trillions of IP addresses. Why would we do that when, again, that's what got us in this situation in the first place? Well, IP version 6 was pretty much created with this wasting of IP addresses in mind. And using this /64 prefix is what makes certain parts of IP version 6 work properly. So things like stateless auto configuration that we'll see in a little while, and neighbor discovery. That's this constant /64 prefix is what makes it possible and is why we use it on every subnet. And the address is long enough to account for all of these wasted IP addresses. So we just don't worry about wasting IP addresses. The next thing is no more NAT or PAT. So no more network address translation or port address translation. So with IP version 4, we use this extensively, especially port address translation. Basically, anytime we would connect to the internet from a client like a desktop or a laptop, we'd probably be using port address translation. Well, there's no more of that. And this greatly simplifies things. So between using always a /64 and no more NAT or PAT, our networks actually just became a lot easier to work with and a lot more simple. Now, when we hear no more NAT or PAT, there's the immediate concern normally that, wow, I'm going to put an IP address on my desktop and laptop that is routable on the internet. That sounds pretty scary, and we're going to talk about that specifically in a later movie about why it's really not that scary. But we need to get into IP version 6 a little bit more before we have that conversation. So if we can burn these things into our brain, basically subnetting is simple. We're always going to use a /64. Don't worry about wasting IP addresses. No more NAT and PAT. Then that will allow us to pick up IP version 6 very quickly.